Welcome to this episode of On Emergence podcast. I'm Laura Sagan, your host and a fellow human being. Today, we're covering a part 2 of the 3-part series where I interviewed Seagle on topics of grief and sorrow. In the first part, and I invite you to tune in if you haven't already, in the first part, we have covered learning with the indigenous cultures on subjects like grief and sorrow. We left our conversation on a cliffhanger as to what is contained in the darkness of the soul, what happens when you start looking into the darkness of your own being, and perhaps in this part you will realize that there is nothing scary and at the same time everything is. I know it sounds intriguing, so I really hope that you enjoy this further exploration of the ego and the soul. We're going to cover an important concept that personally for me has touched something really deeply. And this concept is the culture of the hungry caterpillars. It's a concept that Zach had shared with me in one of the personal conversations. So I actually invited him to make sure that he covers this topic during the podcast. So I'm excited to share that with you as well. By the end of this episode, you will learn about ego maturation and why nature isn't safe and why is it a good thing. Why you can die going into the nature and why it is a good thing. As always, there are easy ways to support the podcast. You can forward the episodes, specific ones that resonate with you, to someone who you think might benefit from this content, as well as just sharing about the podcast with the people that you think might benefit from it. You can subscribe to us on Instagram, on YouTube, and on Spotify, or any other podcast platform of your choice. Feel free to also check out the website where I share introductions to each episode, a little bit of a backstory for each, and perhaps a little more. I hope you enjoy today's conversation.
Yeah.
So you need to come apart to see how the pieces come together so you can fit them in the way that they're always supposed to be.
Eco-psychologist Bill Plotkin would describe this phenomenon as the descent into the soul. In every person, there's a capacity to go into dissolution of the ego. And we're not talking about like ego death in a lot of the ways that like acid heads talk about, like, oh man, I went on acid and my ego died. We're talking about a very long, arduous process of your ego unraveling. And it doesn't die. Well, in many ways it does die, but it matures is a better kind of way of saying it. This is actually a good segue into grief as well too.
Okay.
So this is coming mostly from the work of Bill Plotkin, but David Abrams talks about this. He's another ego philosopher and scholar. Joanna Macy. There are many people who ascribe to this general phenomenon, but the way I'm going to lay it out is laid out by Bill Plotkin, because I think it's brilliant. And I've seen it in my own life. He asserts that there are like distinct developmental stages of the human psyche and conscious. And these do not correlate with age, but they are associated with like segments of like what the growing up process would look like. So he discusses childhood and early adolescence and late adolescence and early adulthood and late adulthood and then elderhood. And he generally says that like the problem with Western civilization right now is we don't have any elders. We don't have any wisdom keepers. We don't have elders because we don't have adults. And we don't have adults because most of us are actually trapped. Our cultures design us to be trapped in this phase of early adolescence. We never make it to late adolescence. And late adolescence is a period that he calls the cocoon. This was shown to me in many visions during my last dieta with Tamamori. I watched a caterpillar crawl in and form a chrysalis. Well, first I watched the caterpillars eat the whole forest. There was just so many caterpillars everywhere. And they're hungry. And they're ravenous, and they just consume. They don't do anything else but just eat all the green leaves of the forest. So why does the ecosystem tolerate these hungry caterpillars that are just consuming? Because they know that the caterpillar eventually will go into a chrysalis and transform into a butterfly. And butterflies are pollinators. And the butterflies will go around and pollinate all the forests for the trees and the flowers and the plants. And it gives life back. I watched these caterpillars, I watched one in my tombo, form a chrysalis. And in this chrysalis, I had always imagined that like the caterpillar goes in and it's like, now I'm a butterfly, yay!
That's the skin routine before going to bed.
Exactly,
And pillow, sleep. And it's like,
But no, it dies. It dissolves. It blows up and just goes into a sack of cells. And it's out of these cells, the cells are reimagined and reconfigurated. And it's like a butterfly is not a caterpillar. The caterpillar died. There's no more caterpillar anymore. Now it's a butterfly. And the butterfly unfolds its wings at its own perfect timing, and it emerges from the cocoon. During the cocoon, it's not functional. It's not doing anything. It's not a caterpillar. It's not yet a butterfly. It's in this in-between time. A whole nother segment we could go on is our whole culture is in this right now, I believe.
So the culture of caterpillars.
Yeah.
Is that?
So in a collective way, I think, and a lot of people feel this intuitively, right? Again, we're moving from the realm of literal factual truth into more symbolic, metaphoric, and mythological truth. Like author Charles Eisenstein, he was doing a State of the World address, which I think is kind of a funny way to introduce this project of his. But he essentially is we're in the apocalypse. But he quickly redefines the apocalypse as the unveiling. It's all the things that were held in the shadow are now being revealed. All the things that were unseen are now becoming seen. We're all we're feeling the earth change. We're feeling the weather heat up. We're feeling the storms and the fires of California and the hurricanes and the BP oil spill. We're feeling these more. It's not a figment of our imagination that these events are happening with higher frequency and higher intensity. It's measurable. We know this. That's factual truth. The feeling is something much more subjective in nature and truth. But a lot of us are feeling that the world is changing. There's a shifting nature of we're actually much more consciously aware of the veil being lifted, of how our internal politics works, how our culture is designed. We're having this huge reckoning with race and racism and economics and caste systems and class systems in America, the ecological collapse. We're feeling and knowing more of the veil is unlifting. And I love that as an idea of that's the apocalypse. It's the unveiling, right? I think we've been, as a culture, feeding ourselves with too many zombie apocalypse movies for the last decade. But those two tap into some fear that's primal. We have this version of apocalypse being one day, everything just blows up. But it's a slow unraveling. It's a slow unveiling. An apocalypse happens all the time. That's a nature. It's a theme.
I have to say that actually the word apocalypse gives me a little bit of hope.
Yeah, me too.
It's just we get to have almost clean slates.
Yeah, because
in a way, I'm oh, now we know. Now we know how not to.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe we try once more to have a go at life.
In a way, it's just understanding the shedding of skin, right? It's out with the old. Something is new. We don't know it's really being born. But it's what the caterpillar does in the chrysalis. It's an apocalypse for the caterpillar. It's the end of the caterpillar's body. It's the end of his world. Bill Plotkin talks about how the human consciousness does this too. We're meant to go into a cocoon somewhere around late adolescence. And almost every indigenous culture that I've ever studied, from the Shinto and Japanese, to the Dogon and Mali, to the Greeks, to the Egyptians, to the Babylonians, to the Inca, to the Navajo, to the Miwok in coastal California, to the Seminoles in Florida, to the Mohawk in northern New York, to the Asháninka in the Amazon rainforest, to the Bantu-speaking people of Central Africa, to the Maasai in East Africa. There is so many different variations of this ritual, but they all have initiation rituals. And their initiation rituals are generally between the ages of 12 and 16, late adolescence, where elders remove the young, the teenager, the adolescent, from the village, and they go out into the wild. And there, they become deranged. Malidoma Some, who we can talk about later when we get into the grief part, talks about this extensively in his book of Water and Spirit. And he doesn't go into all the secrets, because a lot of indigenous wisdom, you're not meant to know everything. The elders keep a lot close, the knowledge and wisdoms, because people aren't ready for them. But Malidoma does go into some of the initiation rituals that the Agora people use. And the young are removed from the village. They have to go out into the wild. There's trials and tribulations. It's not safe. And this is something I really want to make very clear to a Western audience. Indigenous wisdom traditions are neither safe nor are they comfortable. They're neither comfortable physically, emotionally, spiritually, energetically. They're not neat and pretty. They're often very bloody and messy. And it's deeply uncomfortable for Western people to grapple with this because we have positioned as our highest values safety and comfort. But what I love about indigenous wisdom traditions is like nature, which we are, is neither safe nor is it comfortable. In these initiation rituals, the young are taken out of their village. They are not allowed to marry before they're initiated. They're not allowed to bear children, and they're not allowed to play any significant role in the village until they're initiated. And when you're initiated, you move into a phase of development of adulthood. It's what makes an adult an adult. And indigenous wisdom traditions knew that it was really dangerous to have a whole village of children, no matter how old they were, mindset or mentally, consciously as children. Because children, there's nothing wrong with being a child, but you can't have a whole culture of children. They're consumers. They just eat.
They're just caterpillars.
They're just
Eating
caterpillars.
the forest.
And again, there's nothing wrong with that. But you have to have a balance to have a healthy society. When you're a child, it's great to be a child. Be the consumer. Be the hungry caterpillar. But you got to grow up at some point for the health of everyone and yourself. Bill Plotkin really takes a lot of this indigenous wisdom and he puts it in a Western eco-psychological bend, which the idea is either geographically or like psychologically or emotionally, each one of us will have to do this type of initiation where our soul, our ego, starts to go into a cocoon. It naturally draws itself away from society. It becomes unfunctional. It becomes a little bit deranged because it's unraveling. All of the psychological protection that it needed for survival around childhood, that in lines of transpersonal psychology, like in internal family systems therapy, would understand that that we have all these internal parts that play all these roles to keep the system safe, because safety as a kid is paramount. But eventually you're going to mature. And what happens is the psyche goes into a state of the cocoon where psychologically it's really unsafe and it starts to unravel. And all the protection mechanisms, all the survival strategies start to fall away. And the ego drops down. It drops down to the level of soul. And soul, metaphorically, is understood to be down. And this will be a great intro to grief work, too, because the element of grief is down. It's a downward motion, and it's pulling us down into soul. So the ego goes through this process of unraveling. It loses its identity, and it's incredibly terrifying for the ego. And it takes a long time for it to settle into the space. And it's not great if you have a lot of responsibilities. It's really great when you can go out into the wilderness, literally go out into the wild, and allow the water moving through streams and brooks and over rock to soothe the psyche, for the trees to sing in dreams, to allow the soil and the ground and the rocks to hold us while we go through this process. And eventually, what in Plotkin's work he describes as sort of like a valley. It's like the dissolution, and we receive mythopoetic imagery from our soul, and then we come out of the valley with we're initiated. And what we're initiated into is our unique eco-function. Each of our souls is like one part of a giant orchestra playing. And when we go into the darkness, we find what that note of the song is, where it's slowly revealed to us and it shifts and it matures the ego. It may come in visionary states, it may come in dreams, somatic experiences, esoteric states, altered states of consciousness. Plant medicines and entheogens may be used but aren't required. But we do have to go into trance of some sort. We have to get into an altered state of consciousness to experience this, through dancing, through sweating, through rattling, shaking, through ceremony, through plant entheogens. And our soul speaks to us, and it shows us, it reveals mythopoetic imagery of what our unique function is here for. And then after this process, we're able to emerge, and our egos are still being taught. We're learning how to step into this mythopoetic identity. And mythopoetic identities are never vocational. And this is one of the, I think, the biggest missteps of Western civilization.
That was my next question. If you can explain the term mythopoetic, because when you first explained it was really helpful, I think, for people listening and watching.
Yeah. First of all, am I talking too much? Because I'm just going like on a tour.
I'm enjoying it. If someone's not enjoying it, they're not my target audience.
I can actually bring my vase down.
Your vase?
Can I show that on the...
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Yes. So, the vase.
Okay, yes. So, mythopoetic identity. In this line of work, mythopoetic identity, again, touching on the theme of mythology, it's sort of like the story of what your life is. Like, why did Mother Earth, Pachamama, Gaia, give her bone and clay for your body to be formed? Why did the animate spirit breathe the breath of life into you to animate your body? So mythopoetic identity can be best understood through the lens of mythology. What is the mythology of your story as a unique individual? Which I think this is where most Westerners go awry from. It's never a vocational calling, nor is it a societal calling. So it's never things like, my mythopoetic identity is that I'm a doctor, or I'm a teacher, or I'm a professor, or I'm a politician, or even I'm an ayahuasca healer, or I'm a curandero or shaman. These are all vocational roles. They're not your mythopoetic identity, nor is it a societal role. So it's never like, I'm a father, I'm a mother, I'm a child, I'm a brother, I'm a husband, I'm a minister. Those are all societal roles, or king, right? Something like that. Those are social roles. Your mythopoetic identity can best be understood as sort of the archetypal mythology, the story of your life. Your mythopoetic identity can best be understood through the lens of mythology, through symbolism, through poetry, through metaphor. It's never a vocational role, and it's never a societal role. So this is where I think a lot of Westerners stay in the shallow end. They, like, as they're going down into Soul Canyon, what Bill Plotkin calls Soul Canyon, it's the descent, it's the disintegration of the ego. They shortchange themselves. They make the shallow, they just keep it shallow. And they do this most often by hijacking the ego desolation into the mythopoetic identity, by trying to make it into a vocational role. How can I make money off of this? How can I monetize it? What do I do, right? Where the mythopoetic identity is more calling your soul of like how to be in the world, right? Where I think a lot of mystical people sort of stay in the shallow end is like, cool, I've had some experiences and now I'm ready to launch into my shamanic practice without really going in to the deep end first. Your mythopoetic identity is it's the story of your life. It's archetypal in nature. It's more whimsical and mysterious. And what the mythopoetic identity is meant to do, it's meant to mature the ego over time. It's something that the archetypal imagery calls you into a way of being in this world. It's your specific, unique, individual ego niche. It's best understood, soul is best understood as an ecology. It's not like it's not, to me, a very like religious term. It's not like you have your soul in you. Your soul is like the unique function, the unique note that you play in the orchestra of life.
Later on, I would love for you to explain, to give examples of what mythopoetic identity is.
Yeah, I'm going to do it with mine.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So,
I've been practicing with the ayahuasca lineages under the Asháninka, under a family, one specific family, a curandero named Maestro Juan Flores. He has a center called Mayantiaku, and I've been studying in that lineage for 8 years now. In the last 4 years, I've been going on dieta, and I could describe that later. But basically, it's the wilderness experience. You're in isolation, in silence, in the wild, in the jungle of the Amazon, drinking trees. You're not just drinking hallucinogenic plants. You're drinking the bark or the root or the leaves of out of hundreds of different types of trees, and all the trees specialize in different things. Some trees clean blood. Some trees connect you to the element of water. Some trees clean your skeleton and your your muscles. So trees do different things. But this was coming out of some years of dieting experience and many years of ayahuasca experience, where I had slight visionary states. Now, there's lots of visuals in psychedelics, but there are the rare vision in psychedelics, and especially in things like plant entheogens like ayahuasca or San Pedro cactus. Many people experience visuals. Visions are understood differently in the lineage. And I can safely say that I've had a few really powerful visions. And the visions do something to you. They shape your ego. They mature it. They deepen it. Many people, I think, misinterpret them as like, this is what I'm supposed to do in my life. Like the ayahuasca will come in a vision and show you something, and you're like, oh, cool, I'm meant to go do this thing. That can be true, but what can also more likely be true is that the visionary state is meant to inform and mature and deepen your ego. So you're in more of service to old growth forests and old growth villages.
Is there a way to recognize it? Like visions versus visuals? Does it feel differently? Is it even describable? Because you're like, once you know, you know. That's also a perfectly valid answer.
Well, I love trying to describe and articulate the things that are undescribable. And the moment you try to put meaning to it and words, you sort of corrupt it.
Okay.
But to not try to put words to it, I think is more of a danger.
Okay.
So I will attempt to. Visionary states. The ones in mind that I can recognize as like more true, it's haunting. It stays with you for much longer than any of the other visuals. Sure, I've had like fun little visuals of animals floating around, but they didn't inform my life. They didn't change and utterly shape who I am. They didn't hit a resonance that like broke something open. There are some visions I've had that have completely just altered everything I thought my life was. They're equally terrifying as they are beautiful. They're deeply poetic and symbolic in nature. That's how they've appeared to me. So I can share a couple. And again, this is informing my mythopoetic identity. It doesn't feel encapsulated totally yet. It's still working on my ego structure. So what I wanted to do for my diet is actually try to embody these soul visions into material form. And so I can put this on my altar. This object is now in relationship with me. It has special power because I've spent 2.5 months creating it, and it's so uniquely personal.
I'm just going to interrupt you for a second to describe it to people who are just listening rather than watching it. Is that Zach is holding this, the vase, you referred to it earlier?
Yeah, it's meant to be like a water pitcher.
Water pitcher, even more interesting, even more questions. But yes, if you want to see what it looks like, you need to go and check it out in the video.
Cool.
Yes. So the vase that you made?
I made it here in Pizek. I worked with an artist to help me put it together because I've never done ceramics before. And it was really fun. It was so integrative to be able to spend 2 months just working on this one project and carving and shaping these things that were in visionary states from years ago into embodied form. And now it lives on my altar, and it's a piece that symbolically connects me to my soul and what my soul came here to do, which I still don't totally understand cognitively, but it's a path that I'm walking into. So the first one was from probably my second time with ayahuasca 8 years ago. This cracked-faced old Mesoamerican woman just appears out of nowhere, totally visually stimulating. She was much more sparkly than like all the other visionary stuff. So I paid attention really quickly. And she was smoking a pacho, and she was laughing. She looked like Mother Willow, sort of, from like Pocahontas. And she invited me in, and she was like, there's something I want to show you. Come. I was like, well, I'm too damn curious to not do this. So I go down this tunnel, and I'm led into a burning cityscape. Buildings were on fire. Ambulances were running around. The ambulances were on fire. The police cars were like flipped over. There were water mains broken, and there's fire everywhere. There are dead bodies all over the streets. And I quickly walked out of the city and up to a hill where other people were gathering. And these people were gathering, and they were celebrating the destruction of the city. And they left and they wandered through a desert and through a mountain valley and up and over a mountain and through caves, and eventually assembled around a lake in a forest. And they started drumming and building a fire and all celebrating. And that was one image that really stayed with me. And it's come up in so many different ways. I've read about it in poetry, I've seen it in artwork, in other forms. And every time it hits me energetically in a way that like other visions have not.
So you recognize that you come across that same vision, but through other means.
Yeah.
As you're reading poetry or book or whatever, you're looking at it and you're like, oh my God, that is from my vision.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
The other one is this, when I was dieting the Kaminaroko spirit tree, it's a strangler vine in the Amazon forest, and it wraps around its host and it strangles the tree. And then it forms its own tree, its own. Energetically, it heals soft ligaments in the body, especially around the heart, and it cleans grief. And this was one of my biggest teachers in working with grief, is the Kaminaroko. It's a water element, and it connects you to the spirits of the waters. In the Amazonian cosmology, they have a couple of deities of the water, the Shakumama, Yakumama, the Sirenas, which are just mermaids, which is another fascinating topic. And the Sumairuna, who's like the principal deity of the waters. He has hospitals and schools that he teaches in the waters. And when you're dieting these trees, these animate forces become a lot more visceral. They become a lot more tangible. As you're out in the forest in isolation, dieting, fasting, in silence, in meditation, drinking plants, again, non-hallucinogenic, the animate world becomes a lot more saturated into the human consciousness, and you can experience it in a lot more visceral way. One night in ceremony, a lightning strike came out of a storm that was coming through, and the ayahuasca in a black boa, in the form of a black boa, spiraled on my right side, and she was basically like, this is the point of no return. There's something I have to show you. Again, this sort of like curiosity thing. They know how to get me. She's like, if you come with me and I show you, this is the point of no return. So of course I was like, yes. Then this tree spirit lands on my left side, and it's the Kaminaroko spirit. And all of a sudden, this weight that I've been carrying in my shoulders, probably this burden of the world, lifted, and all of my senses cleared. I could smell, I have a lot of sinus issues, and that all evaporated for a moment in time. I could smell the water. I could smell the individual minerals in the water. I could smell the soil. I could smell the rain. And this isn't something I've had access to for many years. And I didn't have this pressure on my shoulders. I didn't even know I had it there until it was lifted. And I felt all this power come through me into my left hand. And I turned to the Kaminaroko spirit and I said, like, what happens if this power is in the wrong hand? It could do a lot of damage. And the Kaminaroko was like, the choice is yours. You can heal with this power or you could curse with this power. And so I was like, well, let me think about it. Okay, fine, healing. And all of a sudden, the weight went back on my shoulders and my senses started shutting down. And the Kaminaroko said, this is the burden of the healer's path. If you don't figure out how to heal with your left hand, you'll go paralyzed on your left side. So that's this vision. And I had a dream later, a couple of years later, and in this dream, an old man looking like Gandalf or Dumbledore, a big white beard and cloak.
That was a vision also within the state, in what state? Was it a dream?
It was a dream.
A dream, okay.
And in this dream, he was laying his left hand on the earth and the trees, and he was blessing and consecrating. And it was revealed to me through this dream that the role of humanity, a role of humanity, is to show gratitude. Because we're consciously aware of things, we have this gift that we can show conscious awareness of the intricacies and subtleties of the ecology, and we can bless them. We can literally lay our hands on things and bless them. Now, a way to understand this is, cool, if I just interpret it literally, am I the person who's meant to lead the people out of the burning city and into the wild? Am I the person who's meant to heal with my left hand? Not necessarily. It's mythopoetic, and it's meant to inform my ego structure over many years of walking in relationship with these images and allowing the images to shift and change. More appropriately is like, how would a person who is meant to lead the people out of the city, if we understand the city as metaphoric in my consciousness to be like civilization or like imperial empires like America or like Britain or any of the colonial powers, or to retribalize or to heal with their left hand.
Rewilding.
Rewilding.
That word when you first mentioned it.
Yeah, so it's like, it's less about what you're doing and more about how the visionary states inform the way that you show up in your everyday waking middle world life. It doesn't mean you need to quit your job and go burn a city down. Or it doesn't mean you need to quit your job and learn how to do Reiki so that you can heal people with your left hand. It means right now, every day, when you wake up, what does it mean to be a person that can heal with their hand? Maybe not literally, but metaphorically. How do they act? How are their behaviors to people different? How does it inform kindness? How does it inform the way in which you walk in the world? And so I think that's a really big part of the soul's maturation, is the ego dissolving, receiving mythopoetic imagery, and allowing the ego to be reconstructed so that it's reconstructed in a mature adult way. And adults are regenerative. They are nurturers. They are visionary artists. They're cultural disruptors. They instill this spirit of renaissance in our cultures. I think the mythopoetic identities inform how the ego is matured, much more than like, what do I do with this and how do I make money off of it?
And I guess my question is like, once you received that vision, that the guidance is like the how, and I guess that's when the step into more adult version is like, okay, I got the answers, I accept the burden of the world. How do I then translate it into like where you're at in your journey with that?
Yeah, and the way Bill Plotkin talks about this is that like the walk of the adult, right, is allowing these mythopoetic identities to continue to mature the ego as the adult figures out how to deliver this mythopoetic identity in a way that the world can receive.
It's almost like a ebb and flow, it's kind of riding a bicycle, right?
It's a relationship. Everything I think can be described as relationships. Like we live in systems of relationship. How do we relate to our soul? How do we relate to our partner? How do we relate to our kids? How do we relate to our village? How do we relate to the river? How do we relate to the animals? Everything is a system of relationship. And so this is just yet another relationship that we have to nurture and to attend to and to care for, the relationship with our soul. Thomas More, another really pivotal author in my life, wrote a book, In Care of the Soul. This idea that, well, in his book, he looks at like the pathologies, and instead of pathologizing everything, look at this as an invitation to the soul. So how do we care for the soul? When we're depressed, is it a neurological dysfunction? Is there some biological, neurological thing happening? For sure. But which is informing what? And in his line of thought, the idea of depression is like, it is the soul wanting to take rest. It's wanting the soul to go into grief. It's wanting the soul to deepen and to mature. So instead of trying to medicate our way out of depression, rather lean into it and go into it as this is care for the soul. And it reminds me of Rumi's Guest House poem. No matter what shows up at your door, be it sorrow or joy, a depression or a pain, welcome them all in as a gift from the beyond. And that's how Thomas More really holds these pathologies. Things like narcissism he talks about in his book. Things like depression, anxiety, and jealousy. These lower, denser emotions. They're not something to be pushed to the side. They're meant to go into. When you go into them, you go through them.
I guess that's, as you go through them, I think that would be, maybe that's an invitation to how to move through grief and what grief is and how to let and other emotion, other experiences. But I think grief is definitely a powerful one to let it through, because it doesn't go, in my experience, grief doesn't go away.
Yes.
It doesn't, it could be years, for me, it's been now 5 years. Sometimes it hits me and I'm like, oh, you're still there. And it's like, okay, even though I know, having done the work, I know that it always stays, and it still surprises me when it shows up, and it's like, oh, like, the grief ritual was like 10 days ago, and stuff that came up, I was like, oh, I didn't know that was affecting my life in that way. And it's kind of like maybe an ongoing teacher in a way.
Yeah. And grief work is soul work. To look at like two axes, especially I'm going to talk a little bit about the mystical community. There's such a concentration on the spirit of above, the cosmos, the oneness, meditation, contemplation, unification, right? That's the spirit of above. That's the place of spirit. Lots of people hold that there's an axis, that the above is spirit. Interestingly enough, I found this out recently, is that in traditional Hinduism and Buddhism, where a lot of these contemplative unification process methodologies come from, and ideologies, you didn't start practicing things like contemplation and meditation and oneness and like Kundalini awakening until you were already a matured adult. And a matured adult, again, even in these societies, meant to go down first. That you have to go down into the dark, into soul. And the realm, the spirit of below, the underworld journey, right? The Andean cosmology of the Inca, as in many shamanic cultures around the world, hold that there are three worlds: the middle world of everyday reality, the upper world of like unification and cosmos, and the underworld, individuation. And it's here in the underworld, filled with monsters, terribly dark, scary, terrifying, and totally unsafe, is the realm of soul. It's the individuation process, psychologically, that we go into. And so there's this understanding, part of what it means to be in material reality, to be incarnated in this 3D world, is to be in our bodies and to be human. And part of the human experience is to go down as much as we go up. And generally in most traditional societies, you had to go down first before you could go up. But we're trying to bypass the down. In spiritual communities across the United States, it's often very much about, it's all light and love. It's not all light and love. We live in a duality of light and darkness. Now, there is non-duality when you get into the higher stage of consciousness, but higher doesn't mean better. We're putting all these labels on things. We're meant to embody both light and darkness here. We're meant to learn and excavate the treasures of the deep as much as the brightness of the stars above. And so the work that I do in grief, the work that I would like to bring to educational spaces, is how do we, again, if we take the basic premise that we don't have any elders, we don't have elders because we don't have adults, and we don't have adults because adolescents have bypassed going down into soul. I want to invite and invoke that into people. And grief ritual is one way, education is another.
Can you tell a little bit more about that? Because I think there's a number of things that you mentioned, for example, indigenous cultures, that you're being taken away into the wilderness as a teenager, and this is not something that I see happening in like Western civilization. And then there's another aspect, is how do you invite, because I think if you are as an adult going through this maturation process, it's very intense. Like you are very extremely conscious and you have a lot to lose, so as to say. It reminds me but I had chicken pox, and I had chicken pox when I was 18. And I was just immigrated to England, and it was horrible. I was so aware of the fact that there were scabs on me. I was aware of the fact that I had to stay at home and not to infect anyone. I was just very aware of the disease that people normally have in their children. So I think is that how do you, in the education work that you do, how do you invite that? Maybe does it need to happen early on? Is it something that parents can do with their children? Can you tell a little bit more about that, to just kind of, so we have more adults in the next generations and generations to come?
Yeah, I like the chickenpox metaphor, because it's actually really, chickenpox is very dangerous to adults.
I know. That's why I stayed indoors. I was in a university campus.
When I was a kid, I got chickenpox first, and then all my aunts and uncles brought all the cousins over, and put us all into a tub. And we all just got chickenpox at the same time. And we all had a blast. We like stayed with each other. We all had chickenpox. We took oatmeal baths. We watched movies. And because our parents knew it's better to get this out of the way, right? This is going to be painful now. We're not going to try to avoid the sickness. We're just going to try to lean into it. And I think a lot of what parents can do, I think the biggest thing is we're losing relationship with nature. We're trying to make nature safe. We're trying to make it comfortable. And it's just inherently not either one of those two things. So embracing mortality of our own existence is finite. We will all die. We have to instill that into our children. This is not permanent. This life is a gift. It doesn't mean we need to scare them, but there's a way to hold it in a conscious way to be like, life is not safe and it's not comfortable. It's not meant to be both those things. It can be at different times, but it's like the storms. There's storms that come. And so life can be messy and stormy, and it's okay and deeply uncomfortable. I think parents can really help by children's imagination is our greatest capacity of the human spirit and ethos. We're doing an education, and I know this from my public school and private and charter school experience. We're removing the imagination capacity and faculty of children, bent on education, preparing students to be adults. And what we mean by adults is like really just patho-adolescent culture of making money, how to survive, or like these base kind of things. We're not teaching them how to live a meaningful life of purpose, of service. And that takes imagination to dream a new way of being. Life is not stagnant. The world and civilizations and people and cultures are never stagnant. It takes imagination of each generation to envision what each generation needs and how culture evolves over time. And the best place to get imagination from is spending lots of time in nature. And we're sequestering our kids to bedrooms and video games, telephones, books, school work, homework, sports that are like organized and like it's not imaginative. Like those games aren't imaginative. We want to allow our kids, our students, to dream, to wonder, to be in awe, to be in relationship with a vibrant and alive world. Uninterrupted time that's unstructured, unplanned, and spontaneous in nature is some of the best ways to do this, where kids' imaginations can wander and grow, where the streams are filled with mermaids again, where there's trolls behind bridges. And this isn't living in a fantasy world. These stories, these mythologies, these ways of being, they do something to the human psyche. They allow for creation. They allow for creativity, imagination, and dreaming. Schools and parents can spend a lot more time in wild spaces. We need to be re-wild. And to do that, we have to be in the wild. I do see a lot of schools do this today. Try. It's very popular today to have forest schools or farm schools, or I see even public schools now. I was part of a private school that it was such a blessing. They took all the students on these big camping trips. However, those camping trips are really structured and really safe because of all the legalities of running a school, and I totally get it because I was the one that was doing it. I was not the only one that was doing it, but I understand the legalities of it. But as a culture, we have to get to like, no, maybe we can have unstructured, unplanned, and may I say that safety isn't paramount. Maybe living the safe life is keeping us really cloistered, and it dulls our imagination, and it dulls senses. This is the thing, is like we have these senses, sight, taste, touch, hearing. They're meant to be invoked and alive, and they're being dulled in a conformist culture, in a consumer culture. Our senses are dulled. Our faculties are dulled. They're meant to be alive and animal-like. We are animals. That is part of our nature. It's not the totality of our nature. I once had a really funny mystic tell me that like
A really funny mystic.
Yeah, he was kind of a goofball. But he was like describing what it was like to be a human. He was like, it's basically a god shoved into a monkey's body. And I thought that was the funniest way to explain it. We were both primal and primate. We're animal and we're divine at the same time, just shoved in together in this like weird mix.
This is probably the best. I think I can now just finish the whole podcast. The things. Okay, so what does it take to be a human? What is human? What is being a human being? This description, it just encapsulates it so beautifully, and also with a dollop of humor. Something for me to ponder as well.
Yeah.
Continue.
The living meaningful life is like that's the dream I'm building with a project called Agora Academy. I hope at some point to write a little bit and reflect on this. What I hope most to do is the kids I loved working with the most in school were the like kind of rambunctious kids that were labeled ADHD, and they were often medicated, and they were often just like, they were the bad kids in school. They didn't like follow the rules. They didn't follow the teachers. They didn't do the program, because intuitively, I think a lot of them recognize it's bullshit. They're like, wait, you're telling me if I just sit here and do the things that I get good grades and then I can go to college where then I'm going to be in debt and I can get jobs like my parents who are both alcoholics and pretty miserable and going through their own divorce. No, not really a good sales pitch. Like, that's probably not a meaningful life. And I think they kind of know that already. I loved bonding with these kids. Probably because I was one of those kids. I loved it. It was so much fun. And we would go on hiking trips, and we would go on camping trips, and it's something I'd really like to bring into the work that I'm doing now. I'd like to mentor and really work with students in high school who are disillusioned and disenchanted with learning. And I want to bring enchantment and curiosity and play and imagination back into learning, as learning is meant to be. It's meant to be imaginative and curious and invoke this deep sense of purpose in us. There's a project that me and my friend, a coworker here in the Valley, are working with college-age students, 18 to 25, to bring them to PSAC in a 5-week immersion. Here's a village of a whole bunch of adults who are more soul-embodied than the default world. And it's a village of basically artists. And they're living really good, healthy lives. They're embodied, many of them. They're practiced. They're more mature. They're more able to sense and feel. Their relationships tend to be better. They're healthier. And so like bringing people here that are college-age students, be like, hey, actually, it's not a dream world, this new earth that many of us are building around the world. It exists. There's a whole village of people. We can go walk around PSAC, and you can see people living a totally different life than you wouldn't see in San Francisco or in New York or in the States or Europe. Well, we really want to take people on pilgrimages, vision quests in the wild, uninterrupted, spontaneous, immersive experiences at places like Mount Asháninka, places like Quinsacocha. Peru really can help us envision and have more imagination of what a new world could look like, a new way of life, a new way of being.
And where can people find out more about the project?
Probably the best way is the website.
Okay.
Agora.
That's good to be in the show notes.
Okay, good. agoraacademy.org. Okay, grief. I'm going to start with a little history. So in indigenous cultures, and many of them, there are regular grief rituals.
Thank you for tuning in to this part 2 of our 3-part series on grief and sorrow. Next week, we're going to continue our conversation where Zach will share the 5 gates of grief, and I personally will be sharing my experience of going through an entire grief ritual in Pisac in Peru in sacred valleys of the Incas under the guidance of Zach. I'm excited to share this personal story with you and hoping that you will feel a little bit more safe and perhaps a little bit more excited about your own grief and about your own sorrow. Don't forget to subscribe, to follow us on YouTube and other social media channels. If this episode resonated with you, I invite you to forward it to the person you think might benefit from it. And as always, feel free to reach out with any questions, feelings, and thoughts that you might have. I'm excited to speak to you next week.